Outside the Wall, and I'm here with Evil Dex and Wally.
Hello.
And this week we'll be talking about The Real Tenenbaums, which is a film by Wes Anderson to complete our Wes Anderson fortnight. This is probably, I think, at least for most of us, the oldest, one of the first Wes Anderson films that we've seen. In my case, it would be Rushmore. So let's start with your opinions, Evil Dex.
Okay, yeah, so this is the second film by Anderson I've seen, the first being Fantastic Mr. Fox, which we watched the week before together. Overall, I enjoyed it. I think I like Fantastic Mr. Fox a little bit better overall. And narratively speaking, at least, I started to notice a few recurring trends in Anderson's work, particularly the use of a dysfunctional father-son relationship. I think we talked about this in the podcast for Mr. Fox, but Mr. Fox has the relationship where the son is a disappointment to his father and is trying to prove himself to his dad, and then we have the reverse scenario in this case where the son's disappointed with his father for what he's done in the past and not being around enough, and the dad's trying to make it right. Um, I think that dynamic was handled pretty well in this movie, although personally speaking, I didn't find it especially touching, although that may be partially because I've been watching the Goofy movie a lot lately, and I actually, as strange as this may seem, I vastly prefer the way that movie handles the father-son dynamic in comparison to this one. This movie definitely still uses the very quirky stylings that we started to see with Fantastic Mr. Fox, and that I'm to understand are a major recurring thread in Anderson's work. It had some unique narrative structuring stuff that I overall liked. It was a little weird from time to time, I guess. Sometimes I think his quirkiness is a little bit too exaggerated. Some of the stuff like the falconry in this, I would give it as an example. I feel like they're laying it on a bit too thick. But overall, I found it to be a pretty enjoyable film, something I could probably watch again. And that's where I'll leave it.
So yes, this would be, I believe, number 6 for me in the Wes Anderson filmography that I've seen. And as Raim said, this is the oldest of his works I have seen. This definitely is what I would consider kind of old Anderson style, and we had mentioned this in our last discussion on Fantastic Mr. Fox, is that I have definitely started to notice now, especially after watching this, a change in how Anderson films and shoots his sets and scenes. Is definitely influenced from that animation style that he's done in Fantastic Mr. Fox, whereas this is very much more closely aligned to a more traditional kind of loose camera, not very particular on how the sets are set up. There's not as much symmetry in his shots. But overall, I think I did enjoy it. It still has that quirkiness that is a staple of Anderson's films. From just the way the characters are to how they dress. The one thing that always stood out for me was how Ben Stiller's character in this and his sons always are in the same athletic wear attire throughout the entirety of the film, and just the eccentricities of Ben Stiller's character being kind of this overly protective father figure to his two kids, and how that kind of plays out between the rest of the family. There is very much that dynamic between the family that is very. I'm trying to think of something other. The only word I can think of is hostile, but that's not quite it. It's just very cool in their relations between each of the family members, and that is something that kind of occurs throughout some of Anderson's other films. But overall, I do enjoy it. I think it definitely is interesting coming from my perspective, having watched Grand Budapest Hotel as my first Anderson film and kind of going back in time from his filmography and seeing and noticing kind of retroactively how he's progressed as a director. So, but I still like it overall and would recommend it.
So this is my fifth Anderson film, and I also say that I enjoyed it quite a bit. It's not as up there as Mr. Fox, Budapest, and Rushmore are for me, but it's still one that I definitely enjoyed throughout. Like they mentioned, at least I did find the overall arc of Royal Tenenbaum trying to kindle again the relationship with his offspring and also his ex-wife. Well, not really ex-wife then, but they're separated, and how he's kind of like trying to win her back, mostly out of pride than love, because he doesn't want her to marry another man, and especially and it's very, I would say it was very nice how it did progress from starting how he really has a relationship that he very much sabotaged himself through life, and I did find the ending to be quite touching. And, but if I had to say, I also prefer Fantastic Mr. Fox when it came to the family dynamics in the end. And I do, well, at least when comparing it with Rushmore, I think it is a bit more noticeable of how he still has that quirkiness, and how, as Wally mentioned, he symmetry is apparently like a bit more perfected from Fantastic Mr. Fox onwards, and Moonrise Kingdom and Grand Budapest Hotel. The first films on he seem a bit more raw, let's say, in that regard, but there are still several shots that are memorable in terms of the coloring and symmetry. I think some of them that comes to mind are with the Gwyneth Paltrow's Margot shots when she goes to greet what is the Luke Wilson, Rishi, I believe. Those are one of the most notable ones that I will think. It still has a lot of very interesting montages that are about the double lives that these characters have lived. And yeah, I think I will also recommend this one. If you like very much everything else that Wes Anderson, there's a good chance you'll also like this one. So if we were to talk about the span on those trends, those tropes that we're seeing in Wes Anderson, the family relationships, as you mentioned, that they are a bit more detached. We think that's what you were trying to say, right, Wally?
Yeah, and I think it's maybe that's part of where Anderson's quirkiness might come into play, is just because the fact that each family member or each group of individuals in his films are kind of just cool with one another. They aren't very warm and affectionate. It's kind of a standoffish type of attitude that they have, and it's very much present here as well. I think that's how some of that quirkiness plays out, just in the way that some of the scenes themselves pan out. I don't know enough about psychology or any of like sociology to understand like exactly if that's a real thing or if it's just unique to Anderson and the way he gets his actors to portray the scenes, and how each of these characters just kind of have their own little personality quirks, for lack of a better word. I hope I can stop using that too often in this discussion, but yeah, I wouldn't be able to know other than just seeing that it's something typically Wes Anderson.
Yeah, so I think it's not necessarily specific to the family dynamics in these movies. Just the interactions between human beings in general are kind of cold in Wes Anderson's films. That might serve to partially explain why I felt a little bit of an underwhelmed emotional reaction to some of the dynamics in this movie.
Yeah, it does. It does seem a lot like that. Uh, well, by the way, what you meant, Wally, was that if it's something that is also seen like in daily lives, how families may interact that way, or just like in films in general.
I think it's just in the films themselves, because I mean I know and I've experienced personally relations with either family members or friends that are a lot warmer than most of the characters I've seen in Wes Anderson films. So again, I think it may be just something as part of the story and just the characters in Anderson films that helps draw out that kind of those weird interactions, which I had mentioned in our last discussion. certain scenarios that would normally wouldn't make me laugh, but just do, just based on the delivery of the actors, that they how they say their lines, and just the that kind of coolness of relations with each of those characters, I think helps that.
Yeah, we can point out that this is definitely deliberate on Wes Anderson's part because none of these characters actually do have particularly strong relationships. There's always some kind of big flaw that keeps them from really loving each other, you might say, in the same way that some characters in a simpler story might.
I mean, I guess to use an example directly from the film itself, the daughter, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, keeps getting reminded or keeps reminding other characters in the movie that she's adopted. And that whole thing of like that's why you can't be affectionate towards her because she's adopted. So that then just but there are moments in the film where that comes out that are, at least in my view, a bit humorous because there's these moments where there's supposed to be this warm geniality, and then something like that comes up that kind of puts a buffer between that. Which again, I guess I should also state too that people shouldn't be going into Wes Anderson films expecting kind of like this romantic comedy type of scenario because he's definitely not that director. He also isn't one that's for like this lovey-dove story either. It's just the way in again, I just think the way he writes characters and the way he gets his actors to act them out just kind of draws this sort of humor out of the films that are unique to his movies.
Yeah, so I actually think that some people, it's kind of hard for me to phrase, people make the mistake of taking their own emotional investment in characters, you might say, to be too important to the overall quality of a story. So, another example I might bring up is the Coen brothers films, particularly Inside Llewyn Davis, which I watched recently. I think some people are turned off of that film by the fact that the main character isn't very sympathetic, and I don't think it's really the intention of the Coen brothers to make you sympathize with him per se. It's more the intention just to show a very flawed person and allow you to think of him what you will. I think maybe you can say Wes Anderson is using that same sort of technique to a certain extent in his films, perhaps this one in particular.
Think
Yeah, and I agree. I think maybe it's easier for someone like me who doesn't necessarily get emotionally invested in certain characters. I just see them for what they are. In other words, now granted, whether or not I become frustrated with them is, I think, dependent on how well the character itself is written out, or uh, how much it fits kind of the niche that the story seems to be going for. But otherwise, yeah, like I would agree that the Coen brothers are probably another good example. In most of their films, they're very much characters you don't necessarily sympathize with, but still are interesting enough to um, leave a note in your memory.
Yeah, so I almost try to take an analytical approach with films, and a character isn't a bad character if they do something I disagree with. They are a bad character if they do something that isn't psychologically true or doesn't make sense for them to do, or something along those lines. Or out of character.
Or is just inconsistent with the rest of the movie.
Yes.
it's kind of what we had mentioned. We appreciate it in Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, how Indy was consistently willing to prioritize the arc instead of just saving the girl. Just, oh, he's a good guy, he's going to save everyone. It's not like I'm going to leave you here and I'm going to make sure that the arc is not taken by the Nazis, which is a nice detail when you see that the character is consistent.
Yeah, we can use Indy as somewhat of an example of this because he's a little bit more rough around the edges than a traditional hero might be.
Or even, I know we haven't actually had a episode on this yet, but we've discussed this at length somewhat. Is um, Evangelion and its main character and how it doesn't necessarily fit the tropes of what that kind of show was and what people were expecting of that character.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, but I thought about just delaying it because we are going to talk about it later. But yeah, Shinji from Evangelion is definitely the perfect example of this dichotomy between people who like characters that are, let's say, psychologically interesting versus characters that they can personally identify with or find to be admirable. Because there are some people I think who only like fiction that portrays kind of their own values or values that they can find agreeable, and those type of people tend to hate Evangelion and Shinji in particular. And
And I would also argue they're also the same types of people who will rail about, or at least insert their politics into different art forms and such, and kind of demand upon the creators to adhere to their politics.
yeah,
So that's about as all I'll say without getting too in depth on it.
I consider mentioning Shinji too because he's not really your standard shonen hero or protagonist. And but yeah, so since we're planning on talking about Evangelion in the future,
yeah, we should probably reserve commenting anymore.
yeah, we can just say
Yeah, I
that
guess that's
Shinji is not the standard shonen hero, and it's another good example of different character that you may not sympathize with, but can still appreciate as a character.
Yeah, I guess since we're now on this anime track, we can mention Akira as well to a certain extent. Tetsuo specifically, I would say, who is a very villainous character. He's sort of the protagonist, although the movie doesn't have a strict protagonist. I'd say he's a good example of a character who's pretty much totally monstrous, but is also quite interesting, and you can understand how he came to be the sort of person that he is, and you can even sympathize with him to a certain extent. So I would say he's an example of a well-written character who, again, we definitely don't view as a target for emulation.
Yes, that's the one. And the naming Kanya to an extent are characters that
Yeah.
aren't necessarily the ones that you would say, yeah, I would like to be like that person. But they're both good protagonists, and their dynamics is their dynamics with one another, especially strong in the movie.
Yeah, and even Colonel Shikishima as well, I think is a pretty fascinating character, and he maybe is a little bit more of a heroic character than those two, but still very flawed. He's still basically an autocratic megalomaniac.
Yeah, going back to Wes Anderson and his films, I think the structures, yeah, of families is something that does come up quite a while. Wally had mentioned that is, in a sense, that's why Grand Budapest Hotel is his favorite from him so far, because it doesn't really have the structure of those underlying themes about family in a way that I will argue that in a certain way there's still like Lobby Boy is a surrogate son in the film.
Oh, I don't disagree. I think it's just not as blatant as in some of his other films, like Moonrise Kingdom or Royal Tenenbaums. Uh, and maybe to segue a bit into a different discussion now, one thing I've started noticing with Wes Anderson films, having seen a good number of them now, is how much emphasis Anderson takes on just not just how the sets are, but how they look. And a comparison to a film we all have seen together would be The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, and how I know we didn't mention this when on our discussion of it, but how like unique each of this sets looked like with their colors that stood out. With I remember hearing someone, I think it was Patton Oswalt, said you could like lick. It looked like you could lick the scenery in the movie just because of the colors, how bright and vibrant they were. And in many ways, too, in Anderson, I'm willing to bet if that film had influenced Anderson at some point, or films like that, because I notice now in a lot of his scenes and a lot of his sets, very uniqueness between the color contrasting that even conjuring up certain scenes now, I not only remember the actors and what they said and did, but I also remember specific things like the color of the walls or what was hanging on the walls and just the different palettes that were used to convey the scene. I'm wondering if either of you have noticed that. Rain maybe more than UX, that's just because you've only seen
Oh,
two
me
of his
too.
films so far.
Yeah, yes, definitely. I agree with that. There's a certain like a color palette and consistency across his films. I think it is I don't remember much with Rushmore because Rushmore I think is more a bluer film in comparison. But this from Royal Tenenbaums forward, yeah, it's definitely noticeable. And Grand Budapest Hotel too.
Yes,
And
the one that sticks out in my mind is Grand Budapest Hotel. But that's also, I think, the subject material also lends itself to having that as well.
Yeah, the setting's closely related to the story in that movie, as far as I understand. Something you can notice in Tenenbaums that relates to this is that sometimes parts of the set will be used for the story as well. Like there's I think it's a stuffed wolf head, is it? Or is it a moose head? That's
Oh, I can't remember. I know what you're talking about, though. Yes.
yeah, that's a taxidermy part, and the way the sets are built kind of plays into the story around that object. Because at first you see that there's a spot where it obviously is meant to be and is missing, and it's kind of eventually restored. And that's you can say that that's like a visual metaphor for the restoration of their family, if you want.
Hmm. And another one would be when the father, or Gene Hackman's character, tries to get in touch with his two grandkids. You have this fence that separates them, and he's based in the fence. I mean, is literally a metaphor for the separation between the two that they've had, whether it's just through the years of not seeing his grandkids, or the separation that his father, Ben Stiller's character, had placed on his sons not wanting to see his father because of how much he hated his father.
Yeah, I think you can even take it further and say that there's usually some kind of partition between the grandfather and the grandkids when they're talking. Because I remember
Yeah.
there's another scene where like has to shout at them from several stories up when they're in the window, and he's standing on the street.
yeah, yeah, that's. I think that's even before he properly meets him, or maybe misremembering. But yeah, there's it's nice to see how the distance separation comes is diminished and practically removed by the end of the film.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and that shows a good attention to detail on Wes Anderson's parts. Not only that there's this consistency of style in the sets, but that the sets themselves can be used to enhance the storytelling.
The only thing I was about to talk with is another thing that Anderson, I think, is well known for is his soundtrack, whether it be just selection of existing music or utilizing one composer in particular. He didn't use him in this film, but in most of his recent films, Alexandre Desplat is the one that has been doing most of the soundtrack for his more newer films. And I know there's like in this film in particular, there's a lot of more rock songs that are utilized in different scenes, like the Beatles' "Hey Jude," um, and even some stuff from Van Morrison as well.
Yeah, so I remember Rain pointing out the music a lot of times. I can speak about Hey Jude for a little bit because, of course, for anybody who doesn't know this, Hey Jude is actually a song written by Paul McCartney to John Lennon's son, Julian, and it
Mm-hmm.
deals with the idea that Julian has been essentially abandoned by his father. And so that kind of relates back to the themes of the movie he's dealing with, too, about these strained relationships.
Indeed, yeah, that's what I was going to mention. I was going to say Binkuro, the link that there is between the music being used and the movies. I think I took notice of this more. I realized more about it when we watched the Royal Tenenbaums with Hey Jude. Evil Dex was actually the one that had explained to me that story about Hey Jude several years ago. So yes, that it's something that we had and we will most likely mention in our Dark podcast. The fact that the music being used also has a connection to the themes or the entire movie, or the sequence that is going on at the moment. So it's not like just
Yes.
randomly adding there for.
And
Yeah,
we might even end up bringing up Hey Jude again when we talk about End of Evangelion, actually.
but yeah, but for Royal Tenenbaums, the one that definitely stuck out was twice, at least I think it played in this movie, was Vince Guaraldi's Charlie Brown Christmas, and how it's tied into like, basically how there's supposed to be happiness and cheer, yet in both scenarios where that song is being played, it's very melancholy and very sad with the what's going on between the characters who are interacting in those scenes. And I think just even not music not taking a literal like going on like discussing what is happening in the scene, but being a contrast to what's happening, or being kind of a satirical take on what is happening in the scene, which I think is also something I've noticed in a lot of Anderson's work as well.
Yeah, I haven't noticed it in his films, but it's definitely a technique that I really like when there's dissonant music that's sort of used to create a tonal contrast between the song and what's going on then. You can think of any movie that uses like a cheery pop song or something like that. Well, there's like an apocalyptic event going on or something.
Or like American Psycho.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's well, even within music, there's it still to be that theme. Like a lot of punk rock music is basically rapid strumming and a more energetic take. However, the lyrics are a bit more, let's say, pessimistic, sometimes melancholic. And one of my favorite bands that does this kind of contrast between sound and lyrics is The Cure. And I think will agree
Yeah.
with me with that they're probably one of the better examples of how to do that right.
Yeah, so another example I can bring up that I've been talking about recently is PJ Harvey and Let England Shake, which is a very depressing anti-war album, basically about like the human cost of war. And several of the songs are written in like a cheerier, almost hummable folk tune song, especially The Color of the Earth, the last track, which is about a man watching but being helpless to prevent somebody he loves dying. And I think it's very effective in that one, in that particular work.
Yeah, they're really nicely implemented into examples. Yeah, I think like check is another good one when I will listen it. Yeah, no, I don't know if we have anything else to say then. Any point that we'd like to discuss to finish our Wes Anderson fortnight?
No, I don't think so.
No, I mean just that Anderson himself is definitely a director that at least in my view, stands out from the crowd, at least in today's cinema. So if you're looking for something that's different, if you're looking for, I can't believe I'm saying this again, but quirkiness, I have to find a better word for it. But if you're also looking for someone who takes an appreciation to detail, I think Anderson will definitely be in your wheelhouse of directors to watch.
Perhaps something like eccentrically dry or something like that.
Maybe, but then we're getting too wordy, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely recommend Wes Anderson too. I enjoyed all the films of his that I watched, so like, I can't say that there's ever been one that I say like I regret watching that. It's definitely
Yeah, so even me so far, I liked both the films we've seen for him. So
Yes, I would agree that he's one of the few directors where everything I've seen of him so far I do not dislike.
definitely. Well then, thank you for listening to us and see you next time.